April 10th, 1940. The roar of German Messerschmitts echoed over the fjords of Norway as the invasion began. King Håkon VII and the Norwegian government escaped to Britain, leaving behind a nation under Nazi occupation. What the Germans didn't anticipate, what intelligence officers in Berlin could never have imagined, was that ordinary civilians, fishermen, carpenters, housewives, teenagers would become warriors of the airwaves. They would construct radio transmitters from the most unlikely materials, fish oil cans salvaged from coastal factories, copper wire scavenged from bombed buildings, vacuum tubes stolen from German equipment. With nothing but ingenuity, wire, and defiance, they would build transmitters that broadcasted hope itself into the darkness of occupied Norway. The sound of these homemade radios was unlike anything the Germans could jam. Not the booming propaganda of Berlin's controlled stations. Something softer, more insistent, a whisper that became a roar. The whisper of freedom. The German invasion of Norway on April 9, 1940, was ruthlessly efficient. General Nicholas von Falkenhorst, who had planned the entire operation using nothing but a travel guidebook, unleashed one of history's most precisely coordinated invasions. Airborne troops landed at key airfields. Infantry poured across borders from Sweden and Finland. Naval task forces seized harbors. Within weeks, the country was conquered. But Norway was not France. It would not surrender its soul as easily as it surrendered its territory. The Germans needed Norway for one fundamental reason: iron ore. Swedish iron, refined and transported through Norwegian ports, was the bloodline of German war production. Without it, tanks wouldn't roll, guns wouldn't fire, and the entire Nazi war machine would grind to a halt. Controlling Norway meant controlling the ore routes, but controlling a country's geography is far simpler than controlling its people's will. Vidkun Quisling, a Norwegian military officer and Nazi sympathizer, was installed as prime minister of a puppet government. His name would become synonymous with treachery across Europe, yet he commanded little respect among the Norwegian population. The real power lay with Josef Tarboven, the Nazi Reichskommissar, who wielded absolute authority backed by approximately 350,000 German soldiers, an occupation force so massive it testified to German fears of Norwegian resistance. Within days of occupation, the Germans implemented one of their most authoritarian measures. All private radio ownership became illegal. Radio sets were registered with occupying authorities. Unauthorized radios were confiscated. Possession of an unregistered receiver became a serious crime. The Germans understood what modern occupiers have always known: control information, and you control people. The stated justification was security, illegal broadcasts from the BBC, enemy propaganda, seditious material. The real reason was cruder. The Germans feared the power of the word, transmitted through the air, reaching into homes where no soldier could monitor reception. They banned radios because they knew that in the human heart there is a frequency that freedom broadcasts on, and no amount of jamming can silence it forever. Thousands of Norwegians defied the ban. They hid their radios in attics, beneath floorboards, inside hollowed-out furniture. They developed techniques to muffle the sound. They risked arrest, imprisonment, torture, and death to listen to BBC broadcasts. There was something in the BBC's measured English tones, in the news that contradicted German propaganda, in the voice of King Håkon speaking from London, that kept the spark of Norwegian identity alive. But listening was passive resistance. What the Norwegian underground soon realized was that they needed to broadcast, to speak, not merely to hear, to transmit truth in their own language, with their own voices, to their own people. This required technology that didn't exist in occupied Norway. It required engineering. It required risk. It required civilians willing to become invisible warriors. The Milorg Resistance Organization, Militær Organisasjon, the military wing of Norwegian resistance, also operated a sophisticated radio network. Milorg represented the Norwegian Military Command's attempt to maintain an organized underground army that could coordinate with the Allies when liberation came. By 1944, Milorg had established a command structure that mimicked a military organization with units in every Norwegian district. Radio operators attached to Milorg units were extraordinary. They had to be competent technical operators, disciplined security professionals, and combat-ready soldiers. If a German raid discovered a transmitter location, the operator couldn't simply flee. They had to fight, destroy equipment, and attempt escape or capture if necessary. Several Milorg radio operators died in gunfights rather than surrender their equipment to the Germans. One of the most famous Milorg operators was Knut Haugland. On April 1, 1944, German forces raided the loft of Kvinneklinikken, a women's hospital in Oslo, where Haugland was operating a radio station. When German raiders entered the loft, Haugland didn't surrender. He drew his pistol and opened fire, killing 4 German soldiers before escaping through the ceiling. He survived the war and later became famous for his role in the Kon-Tiki expedition, from radio operator fighting the Nazis to adventurer sailing across the Pacific. The German response to Norwegian underground broadcasting became increasingly sophisticated. Direction-finding technology improved constantly. By 1943, the Funkabwehr had established a network of interception stations throughout Norway. Radio operators would listen constantly, 24 hours a day, for any signal outside the approved German broadcast frequencies. The moment they heard an unidentified transmission, the hunt began. The triangulation technique was ruthlessly effective. Multiple interception stations, sometimes separated by hundreds of kilometers, would take bearings on an incoming signal. Each bearing was plotted on a map. The lines of intersection marked the transmitter's approximate location. Direction-finding vehicles, equipped with mobile DF sets, would rush to the area and begin searching in an ever-tightening circle. At close range, the DF operator could narrow the location within meters. Norwegian radio operators developed counter-tactics. They used extremely short transmissions, sometimes only 10 to 15 seconds. They moved locations constantly. Some networks established a rotation of safe houses where transmitters would be stored, then moved to another location within hours. The radio operator would arrive, set up the equipment, make their transmission, and disappear into the night. The equipment would be moved to a new location by couriers. The security protocols were extraordinarily strict. Radio operators never visited the same safe house twice. They traveled under false identities, carrying forged papers. They used cryptonyms, code names, known only to essential personnel. A radio operator's real name, their family connections, their work, all had to be compartmentalized. If captured, they carried cyanide pills. The decision to carry suicide devices was not heroic. It was practical. The Germans extracted information through torture, and radio operators knew they could lead the Germans to entire networks if they broke under interrogation. The German terror apparatus aimed not merely to capture equipment, but to demoralize the entire population. When radio operators were captured and their trial date announced, the Nazis made it public. The message was simple. This is what happens to those who resist. Execution by firing squad or hanging, often in public, sent a message more powerful than any propaganda. Yet this terror had an unintended effect. Each captured operator who refused to break, each radio operator executed before a firing squad, became a martyr.
Stories of their defiance spread through underground networks, through whispered conversations, through the illegal newspapers distributed across the country. The mathematics of terror shifted. The Germans could execute operators faster than new ones could be trained, but they couldn't execute the idea itself. They couldn't shoot freedom out of the air. By late 1943, the situation had become increasingly desperate for German occupation forces in Norway. The front in Russia was collapsing. The Allies had invaded Italy. The invasion of France seemed imminent. German military resources in Norway became stretched thinner. Direction-finding operations continued, but with less intensity. Some underground radio networks, sensing the shift, became bolder. The Corncrake transmitter, which began broadcasting from Flaskebekk in Norway in April 1944, operated for 3 months before German direction-finding teams finally located it. When the raid came on July 4, 1944, German soldiers found the facility heavily armed. A firefight erupted. The radio operators managed to destroy much of their equipment before being overwhelmed, but the transmitter was captured. Yet even as German forces took the location, the message had already gotten out. Norway was communicating with London. The underground was functioning. Resistance was not defeated. Throughout the war, approximately 1,433 Norwegian resistance members were killed. Of these, an estimated 3,000 to 4,000 were arrested by German authorities. 62 were executed by firing squad. A further 150 died in German prisons and concentration camps. These numbers represent the cold calculus of occupation and resistance. For every successful radio transmission, there was a corresponding German search. For every captured operator who refused to break, there was a cell in Greeny Prison, the infamous concentration camp outside Oslo. The women of the resistance bore particular danger. Female radio operators were often treated with equal or greater savagery by German interrogators. The assumption of Western civilization that women might be spared the harshest treatment was shattered in German cells. Annie-Sophie Ostvedt and other female operatives in the XU network risked the same fate as their male counterparts. That they survived was as much luck as skill. But for every woman who was captured and survived, there was another who did not. The Norwegian underground included approximately 10,000 to 15,000 people engaged in various resistance activities. Radio operators represented the most dangerous category. They were the tip of the spear, the voices transmitting hope into darkness. Their survival rate was substantially lower than other resistance members.
What makes the Norwegian underground radio network remarkable is not merely its courage, but its technical accomplishment. The engineers involved were working with far inferior equipment than German military radio. They had no access to manufacturing facilities. They couldn't simply order components. Everything had to be salvaged, improvised, or stolen. The fish oil cans worked as shielding, but the real technical challenge was the oscillator. The frequency of a radio transmitter is determined by the oscillator circuit. A crystal oscillator uses a quartz crystal that vibrates at a specific frequency. The frequency is precise, typically accurate to within a few parts per million. Making these crystals required understanding of crystal growth, careful cutting and polishing, and precision measurement. Norwegian technical teams began manufacturing their own crystals in secret laboratories hidden throughout the country. They used quartz obtained from old radio receivers and broken equipment. They would carefully cut it, polish it to precise dimensions, and test it in oscillator circuits. Creating a single crystal that operated at the correct frequency might require dozens of attempts. The precision required, often better than 1 part per million, was extraordinary given the conditions under which they worked. The transmitter output stage was constructed from salvaged German equipment when possible. A captured German radio set
could yield vacuum tubes, transformers, and other components that Norwegian engineers could repurpose. When German equipment wasn't available, they made do with whatever they could find. Some transmitters operated at absurdly low power by military standards, perhaps 5 to 10 watts. But 10 watts, properly constructed and properly tuned, could transmit hundreds of kilometers if the antenna was positioned correctly. Antenna design became a critical art. A poorly designed antenna meant wasted power and a weak signal that German operators might not even detect. A well-designed antenna could focus the transmitter's energy toward Britain and away from German detector networks. Norwegian operators experimented with various configurations. Some used long wire antennas, strung between buildings or concealed in forests. Others used more directional antennas, such as Yagi designs, that beamed the signal in a specific direction. The moment of transmission was the moment of maximum vulnerability. Once a transmitter began broadcasting, German detection equipment could begin tracking it. The earlier research suggested that German direction finding was accurate enough to pinpoint a location within several hundred meters within a few minutes. Therefore, every transmission was a calculated risk. Send a message that was too brief, and it might not contain vital intelligence. Send it too long, and the Germans could close in. Operators developed a standardized format. Essential intelligence was coded in a condensed format, often using numerical codes that the Nazis had yet not broken. The message would be transmitted at high speed, often faster than the human ear could distinguish individual elements. Special equipment at the receiving end in Britain would slow down the recording to make it intelligible. A 5-minute message might be transmitted in 30 seconds, reducing exposure time and increasing the difficulty of German direction finding. One of the most famous Norwegian underground radio stations was located in a natural cave on the island of Halsnøy, near Bergen. Radio Hola, literally the radio cave, was discovered decades later, but for years during the war, it remained unknown to German forces. The cave was roughly 2 kilometers inland from the coast, on top of a clearing surrounded by dense forest. From ground level, the entrance was nearly invisible. Norwegian resistance fighters would climb the forested hillside to reach the cave, carrying radio equipment, batteries, and supplies. Inside, they set up a receiver tuned to BBC frequencies. They would listen to broadcasts and relay important information back to the underground networks. In a nation where radio ownership was illegal, where German soldiers patrolled constantly, Radio Hola became a sanctuary. The rock sheltered the transmitter. The forest concealed the antenna. The isolated location meant German detection teams would be slow to arrive, even if they somehow triangulated the position. More importantly, Radio Hola represents the ingenuity of ordinary people confronted with extraordinary circumstances. It wasn't a military installation. It wasn't built by engineers with unlimited resources. It was a hiding place created by people who understood that if they were to maintain their connection to the outside world, if they were to remain informed about the progress of the Allies, if they were to preserve hope that occupation would eventually end, they needed a radio, and they would create one, whether the Germans permitted it or not. By the end of 1943, the Germans had destroyed approximately 20 of the 80 radio stations operated by the XU network. The attrition rate was unsustainable. For every operator killed or captured, a replacement had to be trained. For every transmitter destroyed, a new one had to be built. The Germans were eliminating the infrastructure of Norwegian resistance, one location at a time. Yet something unexpected occurred. Instead of demoralization, the losses created determination. Each execution of a radio operator became a reason for new volunteers to join the underground. The networks adapted. They became more dispersed. Radio operators began training multiple backups. Equipment was duplicated and hidden in multiple locations. The decentralized structure meant that destroying one network didn't collapse the entire system. By late 1944, intelligence estimates suggested the Norwegian underground had become more effective than before, despite German counterintelligence successes. The reason was simple mathematics. The Allies were winning. German resources in Norway were being diverted to other theaters. The likelihood of liberation within months seemed increasingly plausible. Norwegians who might have hesitated to join the underground in 1942 now saw the opportunity to contribute to their nation's freedom. The tide had turned.
The content of Norwegian underground broadcasts varied. Some networks specialized in transmitting military intelligence to London. They reported German troop movements, ship departures from Norwegian ports, railway schedules, industrial output. This information, combined with intelligence from other resistance networks, gave the Allies an increasingly clear picture of German activities in Norway. Other networks focused on maintaining morale within the population. They broadcast messages from King Haakon in London, reminding Norwegians of their legitimate government and the promise of eventual liberation. The king's words, transmitted through underground channels and then hand-copied and distributed through the illegal newspaper networks, kept alive the sense that Norway still existed as a nation, that the Quisling government was merely a temporary imposed fiction. Some broadcasts were coded messages for specific resistance cells. A seemingly innocent statement, "The roses are blooming early this year," might be a coded instruction to a particular sabotage team to strike a target. German intelligence officers listening to these broadcasts understood they were being deliberately excluded from meaning. The frustration was evident in German reports. The Norwegian underground was communicating right under their noses, and they couldn't prevent it. The psychological impact of underground radio on the German occupation cannot be overstated. The very existence of broadcasts from occupied territory to London proved that the Germans had not achieved complete control. The fact that they couldn't suppress these broadcasts, despite sophisticated direction-finding efforts and ruthless suppression tactics, suggested that resistance was not futile, that Norwegian defiance could not be eliminated, that the occupied nation would still exist as an entity of will and resistance when the Germans were gone. The most common transmission method was Morse code. Dots and dashes at precisely timed intervals, carrying meaning only to those who understood the language. From a German perspective, intercepting Morse code transmissions was relatively straightforward. The technical challenge was locating the source. The intelligence challenge was breaking the codes. Some Norwegian operators used relatively simple codes that the Germans had already broken. Others used more sophisticated encryption systems, including one-time pad ciphers that were mathematically unbreakable if the keys were guarded properly. The encryption keys, random sequences of numbers or letters, were typically delivered by special SOE couriers who had been dropped into Norway by parachute. These couriers brought not just encryption materials, but also updated operating procedures, new equipment, and orders from the Norwegian government in exile. The most dangerous moment for a radio operator was when an SOE courier arrived. A parachute landing zone had to be established, which meant organizing local resistance cells, coordinating timing, preparing the drop zone, and arranging for immediate recovery of the courier.
German patrols had standing orders to investigate unusual activity in rural areas. Several documented instances occurred where German forces stumbled upon SOE drops and firefights erupted. Some couriers were captured. Others made it through to underground networks. All contributed to the slowly developing picture of organized Norwegian resistance. By April 1945, the Germans in Norway were in an untenable position. The Reich was collapsing. Armies were advancing from both west and east. German forces in Norway, which had once been focused on occupation and suppression, now became focused on survival. Many commanders began considering surrender. Yet some German forces, particularly fanatical SS units, remained committed to fighting to the end. The Norwegian underground radio networks accelerated their operations in these final months. They transmitted detailed information about German positions, supply lines, and withdrawal routes. This intelligence, relayed to British and Norwegian forces preparing to liberate the country, proved invaluable. When the final operations to liberate Norway began, Norwegian resistance intelligence provided the situational awareness that allowed Allied forces to move decisively. On May 8, 1945, Germany surrendered unconditionally. Norwegian resistance radio operators who had risked their lives transmitting in whispers from fish oil cans and improvised equipment could finally transmit openly. Their underground networks, built with courage and improvisation, had survived to see liberation. The radios that whispered freedom in the darkness could finally shout it into the light.